So thank you everyone for being here today. I say this every time because I really do mean it. I couldn't do this without the support of my patients. There were several parts of my career at which I considered leaving medicine, leaving primary care, and be here as a direct primary care doctor in this small town has really been a dream come true. And I really feel grateful every day for what I'm able to do for my patients and sort of make a life with what I've sort of worked so hard to attain here. And again, I really do mean that. I'm very much patient supported. I do not get paid from our big five corporation, insurance corporations, no other large, direct payments from my patients. And I'm so proud of that. And it makes, me really sleep well at night, among many other things. So I very much appreciate all of you being here, making this possible for the rest of this community as well. So just a quick disclaimer again, as maybe many of the people's in this room, this is not a doctor-patient relationship that we're forming today in this talk. This is kind of just general information for those that are viewing this maybe later on in time. Again, this is just for general information purposes. I have no conflicts of interest to report. Basically, they're meaning that, again, I'm not financially involved with any of the people that I might talk about today or any of the products that I may talk about today in this talk. Okay, so they're just things that I find interesting that, maybe I've explored or not, and you'll see kind of what I'm talking about there. So we'll just dive right into objectives, kind of talk about, what are the things we want to get out of this talk or that I'm hoping that you guys can walk away with. One is just, again, kind of a basic understanding of the biology of sleep. I think one of the things that's sort of lacking in our healthcare system is really high quality health education for our patients, right? A lot of the times, if we would just empower, I think our community and just everyday folks with accurate information and just a little bit more robust information, I think people could really come up with a lot of treatment plans for themselves, or at least understand why they might feel the way they feel, because I think that alone can be a big frustration sometimes for people just not knowing. So definitely understanding the biology. Of course, this is a kind of talk about becoming healthier. So yes, of course, the links between sleep and health you will see are extensive, if not completely exhaustive, as far as, involves almost every element of health. Discuss a little bit about circadian rhythms. What are they? Why is this important? Just understanding kind of what is circadian biology, how much of our biology and our lives are tied to the fact that we're on a rock rotating at a 24-hour period, around an axis. So, and then certainly kind of furthermore, this isn't quite circadian, but, seasons as well kind of involved there as the Earth rotates around the sun as well. Again, just kind of know the general sleep requirements. Those do change throughout lifetime, and just have a little bit of understanding of what that looks like in different phases of your life. Review some practices and tools to improve sleep. Of course, we won't just be talking about it, but about how to maybe improve your sleep as well. And then discuss just again some trackers and some other technology that can be useful for folks, either to assess their sleep or maybe even to improve their sleep. Talk about some devices that may help with that as well. Okay, so we'll just dive in. Again, anyone has questions or anything like that, just kind of interrupt me. Just grab my attention. We'll pause and ask your question. I'll do the best I can to answer it. So what is sleep? Okay, so I think we'll start with, is sleep just unconsciousness, right? And I think the point that I think what we're finding more and more in science is that is absolutely a no. Okay, being unconscious is different than sleeping, right? Sleep has a very specific architecture. There's very specific things that happen in the brain and body, really largely the brain, right, that really define what sleep is. And so, one of the things when we get into more therapeutics, you'll see is that mimicking kind of that natural sleep architecture and structure is very hard through medications, while making you unconscious may be slightly easier. Replicating kind of the true architecture and the brain waves and all the functions that happen during sleep is very difficult, let's say with exogenous compounds at least. So again, kind of two main types of sleep we call non-REM and REM. Is kind of the way we break up the two main components of sleep. Many people have heard about these kinds of things. So non-REM sleep is broken up into 4 stages, 1 and 2 being light sleep, 3 and 4 being deep sleep, and then REM being kind of a special kind of sleep, defined basically by brainwave activity is how we define these things. So again, stage 1 and 2, kind of, less rhythmic, less or a little bit more chaotic brain waves. Deep sleep is really defined by these very smooth rhythmic sleep waves and kind of pulsatile, what they call sleep bundles within the brain. And then REM sleep sort of actually looks very similar to the waking brain. If you look at brain activity just through electrical kind of measurements, it's sometimes very hard to distinguish between the awake brain and a brain that's in REM. Right, you'd really have to look at the patient, see that they're asleep, and that would be really the only way that sometimes you could tell. So REM does, in many ways, replicate kind of the waking brain state as far as kind of brain activity. Right, so REM sleep, rapid eye movement, is what that stands for. Again, was discovered, right, because as humans transition into that kind of sleep, and actually all mammals exhibit REM sleep as well as birds. We see that one of the defining features of that, aside from brain waves, is also that our eyes will sort of move around in rapid, kind of random, what appears to be sort of random fashion. Okay, so our eyes are sort of darting around, and the rest of our body, actually at that time, is your brain sort of chemically induces paralysis, right? So during REM sleep specifically, theoretically, unless you have a sleep disorder, really you should not be able to move your body until your brain is more in a waking state. There are, again, some things sort of like sleep-wake disorders where people sort of get stuck sometimes in these transitions. This can be temporary. This can be a more chronic problem. There are some genetic issues that can even affect some of this. So that's kind of just maybe a bit of an aside. What's happening during sleep, right? So one of the things I'll kind of talk about is this attitude of, I'll sleep when I'm dead, and how that can in fact accelerate that journey to death, and certainly lower your quality of life as well. So one of the things that sleep really does biologically, and kind of a newer discovery, right, we have these brain cells called glia that will sort of expand during sleep and actually kind of go and recycle and kind of process a lot of our daily proteins and other things that the neurotransmitters, a lot of the things that the brain needs, brain cells need to operate, waste products from metabolism, etc. That is sort of put on hyperdrive during your sleep, and it really helps to almost clear out the brain, right, of some of these, the kind of, let's say, the stress of just waking life. Right, so it is extremely restorative to the brain, and what is good for the brain is generally good for the body, right? So this is kind of a unique feature of sleep during these stages. As we cycle through the 4 stages in REM, we really see that if we're not going through that appropriate sleep structure, that this function doesn't happen as well. Okay, so part of that rhythmic brain activity is probably also signaling to the cells of the brain, right, to sort of amplify this cleanup detoxification process. 90-minute cycles, so you guys can see the kind of figure there. It's a little bit hazy there, but essentially what this is showing is sort of that top line there is waking. This is REM, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So downward is kind of deeper sleep. And then each cycle into REM is about 90 minutes, okay? So every sleep cycle in most people is going to be about that 90-minute period. This may come into play as we maybe talk about napping, or sort of what, kind of waking up with sleep grog, things like that. Often is a problem of waking up in deep sleep, can be, again, very non-restorative, right? So, and then the other thing about sleep structure that I wanted to point out is that actually you can see these small spikes up into that waking kind of brain state, and it is actually normal, natural for our brains to sort of wake up all the way in the middle of the night. So many people will say, I wake up in the middle of the night and I have trouble falling back asleep. Well, the wake up itself necessarily isn't necessarily a problem, right? Many of us actually naturally should sort of reach that low level of waking kind of brain in the middle of the night. Once or twice is pretty natural there. So just kind of interesting fact I wanted to point out there. And we'll talk a little bit about that difficulty transitioning back to sleep and why that may happen for some people. So yeah, so that's a little bit about the 90-minute cycles there. Evolutionary preserved, right? This means that sleep exists in basically every species of animal that we have discovered, right? Almost every single living being has something that sort of looks like sleep in some way. Okay, so there's if you look at sort of evolutionary timelines, this is something that goes back at least 500 million to a billion years of evolution, right? Why I say that is that things that are preserved like that in biology and that are in many branches of the evolutionary tree usually turn out to be extremely important to well-being and something that we should all really be paying attention to. Just because sometimes culture has shifted does not mean that our biology can shift and adapt to some of those things at times. And I think that's something we have seen in the modern world with sleep, with the advent of just electricity, lighting at night, all the way up now to our completely screen-based lives where we have bright lights in our face at any hour of the day in the middle of the night, right? These are things that our biology sometimes just can't really handle in a way that we can understand. So learning and memory. So this isn't so much what is sleep, but maybe what sleep does for us, right? It's an essential part of learning and memory. Okay, we find that again, especially the deep phases of sleep are really needed to consolidate what you've learned throughout that day and to kind of imprint that into long-term memory. Sleep is one of the other functions I mentioned, kind of the detoxification, kind of waste product clear out of the brain. One of the other essential kind of neurological functions of sleep is to really consolidate what's happened that day into memory, kind of put those significant things that need to go in that memory bank there. And then during REM, we think that that is sort of a stage of sleep where we actually have a lot more emotional processing. And this is also during the phase of sleep where we will experience dreaming. Right. So I'm not going to go too much into dreams. I will touch on that a little bit. But basically, what we find more and more is that when people are selectively maybe deprived of something like REM sleep, what we see is really bad emotional regulation issues, right? That some of our emotional regulation is really more, I would say, robust with those of us that can get the appropriate amount of REM sleep. And kind of emotional processing is a big thing we think that's happening during that time. Any other questions about just what is sleep or how we sort of define sleep medically? Okay.
Well, I heard when you get older, if you're not sleeping well and like having nightmares, there's actually something in your brain and some kind of medicine that you can take or something to stop it. I mean, was about that.
Sure. I don't know exactly about the medicine that you might be talking about. There's a lot of theories on what dreams are. There's never really been a total consensus on what dreams sort of represent. We really think of it as, I think some of the experts in this field will say something along the lines of that dreams are sort of the brain kind of mixing, creating situations out of what you might have experienced throughout your life and that day, things of that. So there is some idea that perhaps there are certain symbols in dreams that might represent certain things in your life or some part of your emotional life that's significant, right? So we do know that there's probably a connection between dreams and those emotional centers of our brain that often, again, especially let's say disease states that sort of highlight this might be like PTSD. One of the definitions of PTSD is maybe reliving or nightmares, very common clinical finding in folks with something like post-traumatic stress. So yes, we definitely know that there's a connection there. I don't know that that people can, this information, I think, isn't to the point where we know exactly what to do with that, right? So dream analysis, lucid dreaming, some other stuff like that, I think is sort of still a developing field. We don't always know what to do with that information. We know a little bit about what's maybe creating those dream states. We just don't know what to then do about it sometimes. Okay. Okay, so here are kind of the pillars of sleep and the sleep requirements, right? So just thinking about sleep, I think it's nice to have some language, right? If we're going to talk about how to improve sleep, it makes sense to maybe break sleep down into kind of workable components, just to at least discuss meaningful actions we can take. And so, especially assessment too, right? So regularity really refers to day to day, right? What is your schedule? Are you going to bed around the same time? Are you waking up around the same time? Are you shifting your regularity because of shift work, or because you like to sleep in on the weekends, or other job requirements or life requirements, right? But just thinking about what is the regularity, what is your routine day to day with kind of sleep times. Consolidation and continuity. What this means is how much are you sleeping at one time, right? So are you sleeping just 4 hours at night and taking some naps? Are you sleeping broken up, just two hours here, 2 hours there? Is it a full 8-hour block all in one, right? These are the kinds of things that go into that continuity and consolidation category. Duration, this one should be pretty easy, right? What is your total sleep time over a 24-hour period? This might include everything as well as nighttime sleep, plus your naps during that day. If you are a napper, right, that would get you to that total sleep time, total sleep duration there. And then quality is probably the hardest one to understand, just from without, let's say, other information or technology, right? So quality really refers to, is your sleep restorative? Are you kind of cycling through the stages of sleep at appropriate times? Are you getting enough REM? Are you getting enough deep sleep? These are all things that can go into sleep quality. Sleep apnea might go into that category as well, right? If you're holding your breath or dropping oxygens overnight, then that certainly can destroy the quality of sleep, even though you may be sort of in bed 8 hours, right? Getting good duration, maybe having a regular schedule, but still not waking up feeling fully restored, right? That might be a quality issue. As far as sleep requirements, we can just see here how this sort of shifts over our lifetime. Anyone here that's had children probably can relate with some of this as well, right? But, kids ideally should really be sleeping sometimes, the majority of the day, right? We're looking at infants sleeping up to 17, 18 hours a day sometimes. And then as we kind of grow into childhood, preschool, right, a lot of those sleep requirements all the way through adolescence really start to come down significantly, kind of reaching a low point in our kind of middle age adult life, right? And then as we kind of go to that 64, 65 plus age, we really do actually start to increase our sleep requirements again, as we get into our older ages. So you can see here a lot of these numbers may be a little bit shocking to some of the people here. This is kind of information that I've been aware of for a long time, but I think a lot of folks that haven't had any formal medical education or any other good sources of information from sleep, right, may sort of understand. I don't know, you guys tell me, do these seem about what you know to be right? High, low? Okay. Okay. So yeah, so again, for most of the people in the room, right, we're looking at probably about 7 to 9 hours, right? For the majority of your life, that's going to be probably that sweet spot for most people. A little bit about sleep requirements here. There are some genetic differences between sleep requirements. This is actually rather rare. We're looking at less than 1% of the population that can get away with something like 5 to 6 hours of sleep. There are some genetic kind of variants out there, like I said, that are extremely rare. That again, we see that if they're sleeping 6.5 hours, we don't see any of the ill health effects in these folks. These people do generally self-select for that, right? It's very hard for them to sleep longer periods, or they feel sort of groggy if they sleep for longer periods. Again, a lot of people sort of say, well, I sleep for 4 hours and I'm just fine. Again, these genetic folks, cannot sleep for that short period of time. Okay, 4 hours is really too little for anyone. Okay, and as I said, if you really think you're in that genetic category, I would say that's possible, but the probability is quite low. Okay, so most of us really do require probably upwards of 7 hours, especially as adults. And in general, I tell people that minimum of 8 hours in bed at least is really probably required for most people to get a healthy amount of sleep, right? Because that might be another 10 or 15 minutes on the front end, back end that we're not necessarily sleeping. Okay, so it might even be longer for some folks as far as bed time in bed. Go ahead. A little bit. I mean, I do talk a little bit about snoring. Yes. Yeah. So we will talk about that. Okay. Okay. Some of the links with health. Again, if you didn't have buy-in for why sleep is important, hopefully this slide will really convince you that sleep is important. I just couldn't fit much more on this slide. Okay, so there are more things that sleep is linked with in health, but just to list a few of the most important ones. The number one killer on earth, cardiovascular disease, right? Certainly we see a very significant uptick of cardiovascular disease with folks who sleep less than 7 hours, especially less than, and it's kind of time dependent. The less you sleep, the higher that these risks tend to go. Right, but this is an increase in all types of cardiovascular disease, whether it's heart failure or atherosclerosis, meaning kind of the deposition of cholesterol plaques. So again, increased risk of heart attack, stroke, heart failure, really all of our major cardiovascular diagnoses are going to be increased. Sleep has long been really linked with the immune system. If anyone's ever had a cold, one of the things you like to do is hopefully sleep a little extra, and that often helps you get over that cold. And this is absolutely biological, okay? In fact, when we sleep deprive animals, one of the main ways that those animals will pass is actually from just minor opportunistic infections, right? Because your immune system just completely collapses, right? And this can happen in as little as under 2 weeks, right? So without sleep, most mammals will die within probably 9 to 11 days, right? And more selectively, just on that subject, right? And this was done in mice, not humans. So they deprived mice of REM sleep, right? And they died basically at the same interval if they were deprived of all sleep. Then they selectively deprived mice of more deep sleep, allowed them to get some REM sleep, and they survived a bit longer. Okay, but as far as kind of what type of sleep is really necessary, we definitely need both. It does seem that our biology really does require REM as more selectively as far as just well-being and mortality are related. Okay, but that is how you will sort of perish from lack of sleep. Is basically your immune system will completely shut down, and little viruses that are around us all the time will just take hold of your body and totally kill you. Okay, so very linked with the immune system. That's also kind of related to this next topic of cancer, right? We believe that sort of the immune modulation is probably what increases that cancer risk, right? We're more and more discovering that our immune systems are responsible for a lot of our natural anti-cancer properties, right? Our immune system absolutely has the ability to detect cells that have been mutated in our body and may become cancerous, and will often go destroy those cells, right? And another reason why we think that most of our pediatric and younger population doesn't have as high cancer rates as we do when we get older, right? Part of that is just time to accrue those DNA damages, right? But part of that is also that their immune systems are maybe more robust and able to handle some of these cells as they change. So again, huge cancer risk of almost every cancer goes up with the lack of sleep. Dementia, right? All types of dementia, but especially Alzheimer's, really strongly driven here. Part of that is that waste cleanout process I was describing. One of the things we see in Alzheimer's is an accumulation of proteins in the brain that sort of junk up the brain, for lack of a better term, and kind of cause the biology of the brain to not be as efficient, right? And again, kind of that clean out process seems to really not only reduce the long-term risk, right? There are studies now that show even in the short run that a few nights of bad sleep, you will actually see increases in these tau proteins in the brain, right? And then as we get better sleep, it will actually, you can measurably lower these proteins just day to day, right? So we can imagine what years of that might do. Insulin resistance, this is kind of a link to metabolism. This is interesting, not only does sleep induce insulin resistance, meaning that even if you are making great food choices, right, you will probably have slightly higher blood sugar, slightly higher insulin levels on those days where you're poorly slept. This is induced within, again, a few days of poor sleep. You can really measure increasing insulin resistance as a result, right? The second thing that this does is really destroy impulse control, right? So not only are you going to kind of have poorer sugar control, even with good choices, right? You will have less ability to even follow through maybe on those better food choices, right? So kind of a double whammy there for your metabolism. Again, kind of definitely sleep is involved with growth hormone production, testosterone production. Many of our hormones are circadian. Cortisol is circadian. So again, not just testosterone here, but many of our hormonal systems are really relying on sleep as a major kind of marker in our day. Right. And again, I told you those special kind of brain states really allow our brain to then signal these organs to make these hormones appropriately. So we definitely see dips in things like testosterone, growth hormone, lots of other things when we're underslept. Reaction time, physical performance, right? So one of the things that Matt Walker, who's one of the world's experts on sleep, really talks about is driving, right? So way more driving accidents are actually attributable to being underslept than drugs and alcohol, right? So there's all of these public safety programs out there for drunk driving, which is great. I'm not here to take those away. I think that's absolutely something that needs awareness and should not be happening. However, right, how much do we talk about driving sleepy? Right. In residency, they talked about it a little bit, but I don't know of many settings that's really formally talked about as a danger, kind of as a public health message, right, of how dangerous driving drowsy can be. Right. So one of the reasons, at least in my field in medicine, that, work requirements were actually put in is there were a couple kind of famous cases, infamous, let me say, cases, right, of some serious medical errors that were made because of doctors being very underslept and just not having the ability to make good decisions, quite honestly, right, as a result. And then there were a couple cases of doctors that died on their way home, right, that they were on call for 30 plus hours and basically perished as a result, right, and trying to drive home and falling asleep at the wheel, right. And this is something that certainly I've even experienced and had some trouble with, driving. I used to commute 35 miles from our home to where I used to work when I was in the Air Force. And definitely night shifts, I would have to make some phone calls or pull over or slap myself in the face. So I definitely have felt this myself too. And maybe it's lucky that I wasn't a victim of some of those kinds of things. Go ahead.
So I've always thought of this. Why do we abuse our medical students and staff when you know this information and then yet you have long on call and interrupted, maybe even on call, you might get to lay down a little bit, but that's not really
Sure.
to rest.
Yeah, you have a
I always
pager.
feel bad for people who are going through that.
I think that's a huge systemic issue. There has long been an attitude of, again, sort of sleep when you're dead, right? There's been many famous people over the years that sort of claim this sort of thing. I think famously Ronald Reagan was one of those as well, among many other folks, right? And then in medicine, right, there's always been this, especially in the training environment, there has been this attitude of, well, if you're not here, you're not going to get the experiences, right? You never know when that trauma is going to come in or what, especially in that acute care setting and that training setting, it's all about getting volume and seeing cases and being involved. And yeah, no, it's to me, a very sick culture. I think that's being more and more recognized as physicians are committing suicide and dying on the road, and quitting their field, and great docs like Matt Walker and Peter Attia and some of these folks are really putting this information out there for folks to really consume and understand. But that is something he definitely talks about, Matthew Walker, in a lot of his material about specifically kind of the sleep culture in medicine among many other Wall Street, so some other places where this is really prominent. And I think we're hopefully maybe on the front end of a cultural shift with some of that, right? They did it. They brought in work hour restrictions, right? So right as I started, they restricted residents at least. And again, this isn't true for after you get out of residency, unfortunately. But they restricted residents to 80-hour work weeks, and kind of made requirements around shift work as well. They can't be on call for more than 24 hours, things of that nature. So yes, it's still a little bit ridiculous, but better than it was. People taking, assigned to 30-hour shifts, right? At least now we're lowered that a little bit, and then have put a full work hour restriction as well on the week, and sort of time off restrictions as well. After following a 24-hour shift, you have to have a full 24 hours off, things of that nature, right? So
the last thing I want is, if I'm coming in ER with a medical emergency, is to have a doctor who's on an hour 22 or whatever. Are you able to function?
Sure. And, even if they feel as though they're able to function, right, I would say that the science would really support that they're probably functioning at a lower capacity than their ability, right? So, yeah, so, it's a big, big problem. It's something that certainly, as a, someone in medicine is near and dear to my heart, but, it's kind of one person out here that's hard to make a big change. But again, a lot of people are really speaking up on this issue. And I think it's at least becoming more recognized that this is a problem, right? So again, small changes, right? They require sort of a sleep lecture and sort of drowsy driving and drowsy medicine kind of lecture in all residencies now. So there's that, you get 1 hour a year telling you like, hey, sleep more. And then you get assigned to 24-hour shifts. So, so whatever that's worth, at least they have it, I guess, and at least it's trending in the right direction.
Well, truck drivers,
Sure.
They have to have their logs.
Yep.
Drive.
Yeah, pilots, all sorts of people where we take safety more seriously. Again, it's not a lecture about the problems in medicine. That, among many others, I think there's so many issues with the way that the healthcare system is run, in my opinion, both for the health of patients and physicians. So,
well, when they died, did they die from a lack of sleep, or did they fall asleep and just crash their cars?
Well, it was definitely car crashes. These people weren't sleep deprived to the point where they were dying from lack of sleep purely, right? But that's kind of I don't know, you could argue one way or another, right? The lack of sleep made them fall asleep, which caused them to die because they're in a projectile missile. Okay. So, but I don't know. However you want to word that, but I think to me that's a little more semantics than it is anything else. So, but yeah, I think, yes, they're not directly dying from the biological lack of sleep, but yeah, but essentially, yes. Yeah. Genetics right here, I've sort of hit on that. I'll just kind of touch on that since I put it on the slide. Again, we just accumulate more DNA damage, which very much causes all sorts of problems, if not kind of leading to, let's say, cancer, which would be one of the worst things that can happen as our genetics sort of are destroyed, within our cells. Again, but it can also just make a lot of our biological processes less efficient, right? So a little bit on circadian biology. So here again, kind of the brain and body, the liver and the brain especially, both have clocks within them. The liver is more around food and metabolism, that has a clock that is right around 24 hours. as well as the brain, right? And this is more light triggered kind of mechanisms, okay? If we put a human being in a completely dark cave with no natural light at all, then what we actually see is that our brain clock is, I believe, slightly shorter than the 24-hour period, okay? So our brain then has a mechanism to actually line up with that 24-hour period that is light triggered, right? So sunrise, and many of you have heard me say this, right? Some of the most important times of viewing light are going to be sunrise, sunset. Those do sort of reset that clock in the brain and sync you up with the 24-hour period that you're in that season, right? So again, as many of you know, the sun is rising much later, setting much sooner than it was, than 3 months ago, right? And our brains have mechanisms to really detect that, right? And I think that a lot of us perhaps may even notice sort of seasonal changes to energy, mood, many other things in our lives as a result. We sometimes forget in the modern world, right, that we are just animals on this rock hurling around the sun, and that a lot of what we are as a being, right, really depends on that regularity, right? And that's the setting in which we were all kind of born into. And the more that we try to get away from this circadian biology, the main thing I'm kind of talking about here, right, is that the more that we don't respect this in our brains and bodies, the worse that our health really gets, right? We really do need some regular schedules, right? And again, so I talked about those light triggers, timing of food, right? This is where if you're not even doing, I'm not saying everyone has to do time restricted eating, only eat between these hours. But one big example would here be really late night eating, right? Our bodies are not attuned to really receiving energy at, say, 2, 3, 4 a.m., right? This is sort of out of phase with our liver clock, out of phase with our brain clock. And a lot of times can even, we just don't digest that food as readily in the middle of the night, right? So this is what I'm getting at with timing of food, that our brain and body is really attuned to having food during the day, right? Daylight hours, especially kind of earlier and maybe early evening as well, right? But not so much in the middle of the night, right? That can actually really create metabolic problems, digestive issues that wouldn't exist if you eat the same exact foods at a different time, okay? Exercise definitely can modify this clock, right? As it pertains to sleep, exercise is very stimulating. So making sure that you're not exercising too close to bedtime is one of the big kind of takeaways from this, right? But exercise certainly can be a trigger in the circadian rhythm as well. It modulates cortisol, modulates a lot of different hormones in the body, and can really help set those clocks, especially early kind of first 8 to 10 hours of the day. Exercise seems to be best for really syncing up with our biological clocks. And again, if you think about kind of hunter-gatherer tribes out in nature, 1,000, 10,000 years ago, this makes a lot of sense, right? That we'd want to be more active during those daylight hours, right? Where again, predators and food and other things might be more prevalent in our environment and more easily found. Temperature. So again, the day has a natural temperature, fluctuation. As the sun rises, it gets warmer. As the sun sets, it gets cooler. And our body actually follows a similar pattern, right? So in order to transition into sleep appropriately, one of the things that we have to do is actually drop our core temperature 1 to 3 degrees at night. Okay. And that's why as we get into some of the interventions, you'll see that I really do recommend a cool sleeping environment to allow your body to do that. Okay. And then as we wake, one of the things that actually is one of the triggers, and we think maybe cortisol, a few other things are involved here, right, is the rise of your body temperature again to a more normal body temperature. And that will rise kind of that same 1 to 3 degrees as you get past about 4 or 5 in the morning. Your body starts to warm, and that sort of transitions you more into that waking state. Cortisol and melatonin, I've touched on them a couple times. Again, cortisol sort of supposed to peak in that morning time between sort of 6 and 9 a.m. for most people, right? This is sort of a stress hormone. A lot of people know about it that way, but it's also a hormone that really readies you for action, okay? It releases a little bit of blood sugar. It kind of creates some alertness, right? It does a lot of things to help you transition into those morning hours and to feel alert and awake and ready to go for the day. So again, this isn't about cortisol is bad, right? It's about understanding that it has to have kind of a specific pattern throughout the day for us to really be fully healthy. And that's a little bit of the chicken and the egg, right? Is the cortisol pattern kind of causing us to feel ill, right? Or is maybe kind of our lifestyle not allowing us to have the appropriate cortisol release? I think both directions can really happen here, right? So it really, I think part of that is teasing out with an individual which one of those might it be. And then the other thing I kind of talk about here is melatonin. There's a separate hormone called orexin that's thought of as sort of the opposite hormone that I have listed later in this talk. But melatonin is sort of this hormone of darkness. It seems to be involved with helping those clocks understand where we are in the day, right? But melatonin receptors are all over the body, on almost every tissue of the body. Melatonin does naturally increase as we transition into the dark hours of the day, especially between, let's say, 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. is when melatonin really is rising the fastest. Total amount of darkness is what is important for melatonin. So turning on a light for 5 minutes in the middle of the night isn't going to destroy your melatonin production, right? But looking at low intensity light for a couple hours overnight may be much worse, right, than a really bright light, let's say, for 5 or so minutes, right? Because it's kind of total photons. Photons sort of measure of light energy, right? Total amount of light that's an energy that's entering the eye is what the brain is really sensitive to between those nighttime hours. And maximizing darkness will help you to maximize those melatonin levels overnight. Yes, I am still. Okay. And then here, just about circadian. So again, circadian really implies regularity. That's part of the circadian kind of biology. And what I'm getting at here is that, you know, if you think that you can sleep 4 hours for a couple days and sleep 12 hours for a few days and kind of make that up, that is not part of our biology. Okay. Again, we are very circadian, just like the sun doesn't rise a couple hours early here and set a couple hours early there, right? Our bodies really cannot handle that kind of thing. All right. So, you know, if you really want to be in sync with your circadian biology, again, regularity is what I'm talking about here. You know, not accumulating sleep debt, right, with this idea that you can later pay it back. That is a complete myth. There's no such thing as really sleep debt, right? If you're underslept, sure, you can sleep a little extra for a period of time, but that's never really going to fully make up the lack of sleep, you know. And certainly in the short run, you can't sleep 4 hours one night, 12 hours another night and say my average is 8 and I'm good. It just does not work that way. Okay, you really have to get that right interval pretty regularly, as I mentioned in those pillars. Okay. Okay, so now kind of getting into just some best practices. I think it's best to just start with kind of sleep hygiene, right? This is kind of the term that's used in a lot of healthcare and medicine, just around kind of best practices to allow your brain and body to transition into sleep appropriately. So we'll start here, okay? So I've already mentioned regularity a number of times, right? Not having kind of different schedules. If, again, today I woke up at 6:45, even though my kids were still asleep, my wife was still asleep. That's just how my brain has sort of become, right? Because again, I've really tried to reinforce this regular pattern, try to go to bed within the same hour or so of nighttime. And now I wake up about the same time without an alarm, right? And that's just how my brain and body is. If I'm very tired, sure, I could sleep in a little bit, but for the most part, you know, if I'm restored, that's the time I wake up. And many of you may notice that as you would start to enforce this, right, that becomes easier and easier, right? The body will just really enjoys that regularity and will reinforce this kind of habit if you just kind of give it that little nudge. Okay. Most important is wake up time. If we're having sleep problems, okay, then one of the things you want to set is actually your wake up time rather than that bedtime, right? You kind of transition into bed when you're sleepy is kind of the advice, right? And if you're not falling asleep within, let's say, 20 or 30 minutes, we may get up and try sort of a relaxing activity, right? That's one of the things that we can use to kind of better fall asleep and not have our brain associate, say, the bed with anxiety. right? Because laying in bed trying to sleep is probably universally anxiety causing, I would imagine, for most people. And that's where, again, just don't focus on that sleep time so much as you're always going to wake up around that same time. Another thing that this does for people, and this maybe sounds like torture for some of us that can't fall asleep at night, right? But it helps to build that sleep pressure. If, we are not laying in bed, tossing and turning, don't fall asleep till 2 or 4 in the morning, and then sleeping in all day that next day, right? Then we sort of reinforce that problem for that night. Now, if we've woken up at 10 or 12, right, we don't have what's called enough sleep pressure, right, for the next night. So one of the things we can do to help ourselves is to make sure that we're building out enough sleep pressure so that when we transition, when we're trying to go to sleep, that again, the brain and body is really ready and hungry, let's say, for that sleep. And we will see that sometimes, again, we get better quality sleep when we allow ourselves to have that appropriate sleep pressure. Okay. Temperature right here. So a lot of the literature will say like 65 to 68 degrees. That seems a little on the cool side for me, but that's what the medical literature says. So that's what I'm telling you. I think as cool as you can really tolerate right here is probably what I'd say. Let's say no need to go below 65 degrees, okay? But essentially, right, you just want a cool environment, and then there's sort of some hacks if that's a little bit too cool for you, right? One of the things that can really help you actually transition into bed and actually even cool the body, and this is kind of counterintuitive, is that you maybe put a little warm bottle or a warm pad or something like that by your feet or your hands. Our hands and feet have very specialized tissue, right, that is the blood flow to these structures are kind of made for them to be heat sinks, essentially, right? So when we're overheated or sort of trying to cool our bodies, our hands, feet, and our forehead are some of the most efficient places to absorb or to let go of heat from our core. Okay, and so that's how that works, right? So as we kind of transition to our cold bedroom, maybe, feet and hands are probably the ones that are going to be the coldest, right? Go ahead and put something warm on them, right? And that dilates those blood vessels, actually allows you to let go of more of your core heat, and then you're not cold, right? And you fall asleep and that body temperature drops naturally because you're fell asleep in that cool environment. So there's kind of a neat hack for anyone who gets maybe a little cold at those temperatures, or maybe we have a bed partner that's warmer or colder than us, right? And these are some ways to sort of think about that. Go ahead.
Say that's interesting because I can't fall asleep with my feet up.
Sure.
So they call them, I go, or to get warm and I go to sleep. So
Yeah.
That follows.
Yeah.
It sounds counterintuitive, like you said. But
right. And a warm bath actually functions in this way as well. So when you warm the body to that degree, as you transition out of that warm water, what's going to happen is the body is going to sort of bring into action a lot of its natural cooling mechanisms, right? So this is kind of another hack that's a little bit counterintuitive, right? And the opposite is true of, let's say, cold water, right? Cold water actually warms your body over time, the time following, right? Again, kind of you think about the body tends to try to adapt to what you're doing about it. That's what really explains this, right? You've heated the body, now the body's going to try to cool. You've cooled the body's going to try to heat, right? So that's the right way to kind of think about temperature and how our body's going to react to, let's say, exposures. Okay. So that's the deal with the warm bath. Light, I think I've sort of hit on, again, maximizing daylight and darkness. Again, sunrise, sunset being specific times that can kind of set the clocks in our brain. But again, total amount of light, total amount of darkness are things that the brain calculates as well. Definitely involved with melatonin release. Again, can even balance some hormones like vitamin D people know about, but estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, lots of other things in our body actually respond to the amount of light we're getting. So again, recently, I think this was in Casey Means' work, right? 92 or 93% of our time, on an average American's time, is spent indoors now. Okay, that is very scary to me. Okay, again, we are not beings that can really. I think the more we take ourselves out of natural environments, we're just seeing that health problems are accruing, and I'm very hesitant to say that there's no link there. I just think there's got to be. And I think the more and more that every study shows this, I'm more convinced that, you know, a part of our modern kind of health problem is the fact that we are a little bit more disconnected from nature, right? Getting out into nature. And that involves not just light, but temperature differences, right? So yeah, it's hot. Yeah, it's cold. You know, that's good for you, right? You have to stress the body in that way, right? Always being in a 70-degree environment with perfect humidity and this and that, right, does not seem to be optimal for our body, right? We have to give it some stressors for it to be adaptable to different situations. Stimulants here, I'll kind of just touch on. Caffeine, you know, there's some evidence that even, you know, a small amount of caffeine in the morning may affect nighttime sleep in some people. So that's kind of bad news for those of us that really like caffeine or coffee or other caffeine products. Again, I'm not here to say that if you are sleeping just fine that you need to do anything with your caffeine. But if you're not sleeping fine, I think this is something you may want to look at. Again, huge variety of metabolism with caffeine and other caffeine products, you know, depending on the type of caffeine that you're taking. But, you know, people have different enzymes that process these. Some people are kind of low caffeine responders. Some people are high caffeine responders. So a huge individual variety here. So I tried to pick just some kind of general averages to think about time-wise. So if you're avoiding caffeine for at least 8 to 10 hours, most people are going to do pretty well with that kind of interval between, let's say, transitioning into bed. With exercise, that's a little bit shorter, right? So try not to exercise maybe about 2 hours before you go to bed, right? Again, very stimulating activity. And so one of the themes here is, again, avoiding stimuli of anything, any kind, right? Things that are highly activating to the brain or body. You really want to be avoiding within those, especially 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. And that might be things like emails, social media, politics, news, you know, so lots of things, again, that certainly can be worth your time. And I'm not here to say that you can never read emails or go on social media or care about politics. I'm just saying maybe think about the timing of that, right? If you're reading, you know, hateful news media at 9 and 10 p.m., right, that often is it's intended, right, to activate you and sort of make you feel some sort of way. I mean, that's what this is. They're selling a product, and that's what they're selling. What they're trying to capture is your attention, right? So that is very intentional. And what the power we have, right, is to put the device down, to not read that thing, or to, you know, again, I think it's unfair for me to say, hey, read the news and just try not to be affected by it. I think it's a much better policy to just not read it at that time. Okay. And again, lots of things can go into that category there. So again, kind of the principle we're talking about here is stimulus control, right? Just making sure you understand what sort of stimulates you, what activates you mentally, physically, and making sure that you're not doing those things later at night, right, as you're trying to transition into bed. Or maybe knowing that if you have to do those things, that maybe we need to use some additional relaxation tools or sort of use something else to try to transition us out of that stimulated state if we really want to get a good night's sleep or not lay in bed sort of tossing and turning. Yes.
Sound machines.
Sure.
And fans versus total silence. And then also weighted blankets.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety and things like that.
Yeah, so I think these things, I believe there's some data on weighted blankets that is positive. I can't recall that right off the top of my head, but I think it can be a nice intervention for many people. They do find that very calming, soothing. So yes, absolutely. I think this is a highly individualized kind of space, right? Some people really prefer complete quiet, so I might be more on the quiet kind of end. I remember one time where I had, you know, a roommate that really liked a white noise machine, and at that time I had to start investing in some earplugs because that was so that combo works well for me. I have like very light white noise behind earplugs. I slept great. There's also a train that used to come by when I was living at that place, so that was problematic. But So anyway, so but yeah, so I think that's a highly kind of personalized arena, right? Many people really like a light fan or a white noise machine or some other kind of calming noise. You know, there's these diurnal beats that are sort of gaining maybe some evidence for actually transitioning our brains into different states. You know, we know for a fact that music is, or musical rhythm, let's say, is something that is, again, highly preserved through evolutionary biology, right? Our brains are very attuned to rhythmic kind of things in the environment, whether it's drumming or bidiurnal beats or some other kind of rhythmic music or noise. And then the other thing I'll say about kind of noise and sleep, right, is that music alone, right? So just listening to music, this is kind of interesting study. Subjects were asked to listen to music of their liking for about 30 minutes with no other intention, right? And this actually showed measurable activation of what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, right? The kind of rest, digest, kind of sleep half of our nervous system. A lot of the stimulus control is really around transitioning from that sympathetic kind of ready for action kind of, this is more in the involuntary nervous system, right? Are you sort of more geared for action? Are you sort of in a state that's more ready for rest and digest? And listening to music for 30 minutes actually will transition our brains into kind of that more rest digest part of our nervous system. So again, there's a strong connection, I think, between sound and things like neurological states and sleep. But specifically with white noise, I would say that's probably a personal kind of thing for people. But a great idea to try. I mean, if you live in a co-living situation or have a lot of other noises just around you from whatever, you know, there's trains here too. I think it can really help to block out some of that and help you stay asleep maybe if you're in a noisy environment. Food and nutrition here. So just kind of referring to that late night eating, right? That our brain, or sorry, our body is not really attuned to eating late at night. And that does create some problems. Eating can raise core body temperature as well as alcohol, right? So this is another way that you can just hear from the biology of sleep that we're sort of interfering. I told you for ideal kind of deep sleep and transitioning through the phases of sleep, we have to lower that core body temperature. Then we're actively doing something that requires our body temperature go up, right? So those two things are a bit incompatible. And that's, so again, food can act in a number of different ways to interrupt sleep. You know, I've a number of patients I've had throughout the years, right, that sort of have this wake up at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning and sort of go to food as a way to kind of fall back asleep. And I've definitely heard that story, and I think a lot of people maybe have even experienced that. Part of what's happening there, right, is that generally you're waking up at that hour because of sort of anxiety, quite honestly, is sort of overactivation, right? The brain is too active and can't, you know, as it sort of comes into this alert phase, it sort of pops directly into awareness and alertness and can't transition back into the sleep phases. And then you go and eat something because it releases dopamine. Generally, people will get up and eat something carb heavy, okay? And what that does is release a bunch of dopamine, kind of make you feel good, calm you down a little bit, and then you transition back into sleep. You can see why this isn't the healthiest pattern, however, right? And eventually that really starts to snowball and cause other issues. Let's say it's not a sleep issue, right? That may manifest as now a metabolism or a weight issue. So a lot of reasons why I think that even in the short run, while that can help people to get back to sleep, I think that still is a problem that should be addressed in the long run. So that's what I'll say kind of about late night eating. Avoiding alcohol, I think, again, a lot of people, I think this is becoming more well known that alcohol is not a sleep aid, right? For many, I think, years, that was kind of an attitude, oh, we'll have a glass of wine or two or a beer or two, right, or a drink, and that'll help me kind of get into bed. And it may help you transition to bed a little bit faster, right? So it does lower what's called sleep latency, meaning the time from when you enter your bed to when you're asleep, right? However, it sort of destroys your sleep architecture, right? You don't get as much REM, You don't get as much deep sleep. So really the essential two parts of our sleep cycle are really destroyed by things like alcohol, as well as many other medications and drugs for that matter. So just something to kind of think about. Again, a good interval here might be something like 6 or 8 hours is what we see with alcohol use, right? So I'm not necessarily promoting day drinking, but if you really want to get a better sleep that night, you may want to consider having your alcohol a little bit earlier in the day and allow that to kind of fully get out of your system. And again, I think a lot of us, that maybe especially don't drink maybe regularly. I think one thing I recognize now is that even if I have more than one drink, that I will wake up kind of sweaty hot sort of thing in the middle of the night. So I definitely noticed some of that temperature stuff in myself and a little disrupted sleep as a result. So
if you're waking up at 2 and 3 and 4:30 in the morning, what's the best way to go back to sleep then?
I can't say that there's one best way, but there's a number of tools we'll discuss here. I mean, I think mostly I would say the majority of people, the reason they can't get back to sleep at that time is going to be mental. Okay. And so a lot of these tools that I would suggest at that time might be in the realm of sort of like physical relaxation routines. So this could involve like yoga, qigong, other kind of named techniques, meditative techniques. So non-sleep deep rest, guided imagery, just a mindfulness routine. So many different things there that you can try. Body scans, kind of body relaxation, where you kind of squeeze and loosen each part of your body. There's all sorts of different prompts that we can use. If none of that is working, I'd sort of mentioned a little bit earlier in the talk that maybe we have to get out of bed, right? As painful as that might be, right? But oftentimes what's happening, right, is we've built a subconscious connection between our bed and anxiety, right? And again, just because not sleeping is such a frustrating kind of thing, we are all subject to what's called classical conditioning, right? Meaning that if you're in a certain setting and the same thing keeps happening, that our brain starts to anticipate that that's going to happen just from being in that setting, right? So that's basically what's happening, right? Is that even though you may come to bed feeling sleepy, feeling, ready to transition into bed, folks that do have consistent sleep problems sometimes, again, subconsciously, as they kind of lay there, they'll become more and more and more awake and more anxious, and that's what I'm talking about with this kind of classical conditioning phenomenon. And the way to break that cycle, right, is to break the cycle, to do something different, right? So to get out of bed, use one of these other tools. Again, sometimes this is very hard, right? You're tired, you haven't slept well, you're grumpy. I already told you your impulse control and all of this stuff goes out the window. So I get it. When you're in a sleep deprived state, I can understand how hard it could be to do some of these things. But honestly, there's just not a better way, right? I mean, we'll talk a little bit about chemicals and medicines and things of that nature. And those can be a part of that too. But long term, I just don't know that there's really a better way out of this issue, right? And if we can't get to that, I sleep 8 hours soundly in bed every single night, right? You do the best you can. If you're at 4 and you can get to 6, great. Maybe we add a nap during the day, right? Or whatever, right? I mean, we can get creative here. This is not about trying to follow some specific prompt or guideline and hit some specific numbers for everybody, right? It's really about building a personalized plan and sleeping better, feeling better, right? This is what it's ultimately about, is getting more out of your life, right?
So it's not accumulative. I mean, you're just saying, well, maybe take a nap because you didn't get enough. But then I wonder, well, where did those REM sleep and all those different things that need to happen? Because if you're just taking a nap, you're probably not going into that.
So I do talk about naps here in a second. I think I'll just go to the next slide. Again, building a wind down routine. Let me just hit that. So all I'm saying here is think about regularity, right? So this is what I'm getting at here. Not only is maybe wake up time regular, but think about maybe having a regular bedtime routine. Okay, I'm gonna read something non-inflammatory for 10 minutes, right? Maybe I'll do a little bit of a stretching or some other routine, especially for those of us that might have aches and pains, joint pains, etc., right? Doing a little bit of light movement, stretching might really help us overnight. Maybe a bath, maybe a whatever meditation app or something else like that. There's hypnosis apps out there. So many different things we can use as a part of this routine, but just building a routine that feels good to you, right? And trying to follow that most nights, I think, can really be an important part of that sleep hygiene practice. So to kind of address the naps, I do have this on this slide here. So if we're not getting that consolidated sleep overnight, I think naps can be a healthy part of people's lives, okay? And if we're looking for, let's say, sort of a short restorative nap that's really just purely around energy, right? I'm just kind of fatigued, I don't have that much time, right? 20-minute interval is a nice interval. Right, what this allows you to do is get a little bit of those first 2 stages of sleep, and then you end up waking up before you go into kind of the middle of those stage 3 and 4 sleep. Because what's going to happen with naps, right, is that if you're in those deeper phases of sleep and you wake up, you're actually going to feel worse than you did before your nap, on average. Again, not for everybody, but a lot of times that's what, let's say, you'll be at risk for. Okay, so then if you have the time and you do want to hit a REM cycle with your nap, you might sort of set a time closer to 90 minutes, right? That allows you to transition through all of the stages of sleep, get that maybe 15, 20 minutes of REM, and then wake up naturally more restored, right? So that's what I'd say around what you said, is that we would want to sort of tailor the nap times based on what kind of happened that night, right, to adjust for that. So that's how I sort of navigate the nap situation. You know, there are many cultures over humanity that really do break up their sleep maybe into 2 or 3 phases. 2 can probably be the most common, as opposed to sort of one consolidated sleep session overnight, right? Almost all human cultures have slept overnight, right? And then many human cultures, right, have this second kind of phase of sleep in the middle of the day, right? Famously, the siesta, right, in Spain. But lots of other cultures have actually exhibited this kind of thing, right, where we kind of wind down, have a little wind down, and maybe even a nap period for an hour or 2 in the middle of the day, right? And this looks like somewhere between maybe 12 and 2, right? Initiating that rest period about that time seems to be the least interfering with, let's say, nighttime sleep. Okay, so that's kind of best practices around napping, right? The only reason maybe not to nap, right, if you're underslept, is that if you notice that it really destroys your nighttime sleep, right? And that kind of goes back to this principle of sleep pressure, right? So naps do relieve sleep pressure. And so if one of the things that really may, again, this may involve some journaling, tracking, right? If you're noticing every time you try to nap that your nighttime sleep is much worse, then yeah, maybe eliminating the nap is something that I would recommend. But outside of, let's say, interfering with nighttime sleep, I do think that naps can be a healthy part of a sleep routine. Okay.
They need to be at
Appropriately
appropriate-
timed and appropriate intervals, right? So.
Because if you're falling asleep in a chair at 5 o'clock,
Right. Then that
that
is very high risk for, yeah, exactly, sort of interfering with nighttime sleep. Yeah.
Or I'm dead tired and I want to sleep,
Sure.
and it's say 6 or 7 o'clock. I'm like, well, you can't lay down now because then if I do sleep, I'll be able to, and then that wraps up.
Absolutely. Right. So, yeah, I mean, those are definitely situations I think a lot of us have faced over our lives for different reasons. And sometimes there's not a great answer, right? Sometimes it's just, yeah, sleep's not going to happen well for this 24-hour, 48-hour period, right? And that's okay. Again, what we're talking about is, 80, 90% of the time, what is going on, right? If we need to make some exceptions because we're traveling or whatever, someone's sick or whatever is going on, right? I think that's just life, right? And what we're trying to talk about here is more what's happening on day to day on a more regular kind of basis, right? So.
Because we need that routine. I mean, and that's seen in young children.
Yes.
If they get out of their routine, get away.
Right.
No, it's not gonna be.
Yeah, and you know, I don't know that all adults really grow out of that. I think we sort of lie to ourselves that maybe we do. But you know, I will say if I really look at my own experience, at least, I certainly know for a fact what sleep deprivation can do to my general attitude and friendliness. So again, just speaking from a personal level, you guys can explore for yourselves if that's true. But I know at least for me, and at least statistically, that seems to be very true. So, okay, so a couple other tools here. I think I've hit on a few of these. There's some sleep workbooks out there. There are a couple choices. I'm trying to build. I actually have a little Google Drive folder that has a lot of helpful resources. I actually put a couple of these sleep journals on there recently as I was developing this talk. We do stock a few in the office. I like to use Quiet Your Mind and Get to Sleep, just because, again, I've heard some very good reviews from folks I trust in this field on that particular workbook. That's not to say any of these other ones are not helpful. Most of these workbooks are going to draw from a body of literature called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Insomnia, CBTI. Okay, this is medically the first line treatment for insomnia, right? As far as kind of sleep guidelines and sleep medicine goes, right? We have really shifted from any kind of medicine to really behavioral therapy being first line for sleep, right? That is the official recommendation, and one that I very much agree with and think is a smart recommendation. So again, sleep journaling, sleep workbooks, just journaling in general, right? This can be a very positive thing, just helping to manage anxiety, other mood things that might be interfering with sleep, just gaining understanding of your sleep, right? You know, I had a great day. I slept great, right? Oh, I exercised 1 hour before bedtime. I had very terrible sleep. Yeah, just understanding those patterns in your own body. What is it in you that's really a barrier? Is it mood? Is it I'm eating late? Is it, I never exercise or get sunlight? Is it, I don't know, right? Is it all these things? And again, just some data here often helps both you yourself, right, as well as maybe a healthcare provider to have more detail of how to actually help you specifically, rather than giving you some generic kind of interventions. Okay. So this involves both, like I said, that workbook, as well as maybe sort of journaling as an aside there, both for a variety of different reasons. Meditation and non-sleep deep rest is what NSDR, it should be non-sleep deep rest. That's the typo there. So non-deep sleep rest. Anyway, so NSDR is actually what it should say, non-sleep deep rest. This is a protocol that has actually a more ancient spiritual practice that's named Yoga Nidra, is what this is derived from. There are some secular prompts out there if you don't like some of the spiritual elements of, say, a Yoga Nidra prompt, right? So just kind of know yourself if you'd rather have a little bit more kind of a, Eastern philosophy, more spiritual prompt, maybe look up something like Yoga Nidra. If you want something that's more just kind of nuts and bolts, hey, go through these actions sort of thing, then actually Andrew Huberman has a very secular form of non-sleep deep rest. I do have the links to those videos on my website as well. This can also be used as sort of a replacement for sleep, almost act like a nap a little bit. So they have 10-20-minute prompts, right? And if you don't have time to nap, if you just don't like to nap, that is very difficult. It takes a long time for you to transition into sleep, right? A 20-minute nap, maybe a 40-minute endeavor. Then maybe we stick with a 10 or 20-minute prompt. And what we see with an exercise like Yoga Nidra or non-sleep deep rest is that it's highly restorative, can actually restore attention, focus, some things like that for folks. Doesn't necessarily replace sleep and the long-term health benefits of sleep, but at least in the short run, if you really want a little boost in energy, focus, attention, maybe some mood stability, right? This is a tool that we can use sort of in those moments where either we didn't get enough sleep, can't nap, or, again, you can see some situations where this could apply. Light yoga, relaxing movements, I think I've already kind of hit on that, right? There's a number of different things that you can do. This can just be, again, what I don't want, right, is you don't want to start doing movement that's significantly raising your heart rate, right? So, a little bit of light movement, heart rate's under 100, right? I think that's all good, right? If you're starting to exert to the point where you're maybe starting to get breathless, certainly starting to break a sweat, You've gone way too far. Okay, we're talking about it's not exercise. We're talking about light, relaxing movements here. Nothing that's really approaching exercise per se. Okay. Sleep therapists. So again, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia can be done in person, right? There are therapists out there that are trained specifically in these techniques to help you with sleep. Just therapy in general, right? So let's say again that anxiety or some of these other mental health issues are your main barrier to sleep, right? Certainly, getting over those issues or learning some tools to handle, especially in those moments of high anxiety, right? These are things that very much should be considered and maybe pursued for those of us that it might be useful. And some of these workbooks that have a lot of those tools as well. So this doesn't always need to be, paying to go see a therapist, spend an hour every week, right? There's a lot of other platforms out there to sort of do self-therapy, to do online therapy, right? And sort of functionally still maybe have a therapist, but not in the traditional sense. But again, something that I think is highly valuable in those lives that it's needed. Sleep apnea. So this is where I kind of talk a little bit about snoring as well, right? So sleep apnea, one of the major barriers sometimes the quality of sleep, right? A lot of people with sleep apnea are in bed at appropriate times, maybe asleep for appropriate times, right? But then if you're not able to breathe during your sleep, you can imagine that that might cause some problems, especially long term. We see all sorts of major health problems increase the longer and longer that sleep apnea is untreated, right? We think that untreated sleep apnea could easily cut your life short by a number of years, probably upwards of 3 to 5, okay? Increases high blood pressure, heart disease, lots of problems, diabetes, dementia, lots of problems with sleep apnea. So most people know about the CPAP machine. One of the things I want, and snoring is not always sleep apnea, right? So you can be a snorer and still be oxygenating just fine. Although snoring is sort of a risk factor, you'd have to sort of ask the question. I think if you're really snoring for significant times overnight, you'd really want to ask the question, especially again, if you're having symptoms of poor sleep, right? Not feeling restored within an hour or so of waking up consistently, even though you're in bed 8, 9, 10 hours, right? This would be absolutely, you need to be tested for sleep apnea. CPAP is not the only answer here, is really what I'm here to tell you, right? I think most people know, okay, I'm not breathing, they put a mask on you. Well, that's not the only option here, right? You can actually fix snoring through exercises, jaw and palate exercises. Okay, I have a resource for that. It's actually from the Sleep Foundation of America. Okay, so sleepfoundation.org, I believe it'll be on the resources page. But again, a number of different exercises, kind of a tongue push up, you push your tongue up the top of your palate, you push your tongue down to the bottom of your palate, some other kind of jaw kind of exercises. In fact, this article even talked about singing, okay? So just trying to really hit all the different kinds of notes, make a variety of different noises with your mouth and palate, right? That sort of acts as a bit of an exercise there. And they've shown that people that, sing throughout the day actually can lower the rates of snoring, okay? So singing in the shower, there you go. And again, lots of different, oral appliances. There are some breathe right strips. If it's allergies, we'd want to treat maybe allergies or a deviated septum. Lots of different ways that breathing can be involved in sleep. Selectively nasal breathing seems to also help. So if you're a mouth breather, nose breathing throughout the day will encourage more nose breathing at night. If you exercise, you try to breathe through your nose selectively during exercise, that strengthens that, nose breathing as well. So a lot of different things kind of in that breathing world that might be involved with helping your sleep as well. Mouth taping, so that selectively forces you to breathe through your nose. So literally just a little piece of tape in the middle of your lips there at night. They make all sorts of mouth tapes now that are kind of customized to seal the whole lips and all sorts of different things. I experimented a little bit with this and found that it wasn't really that different for me, whether I taped or not. I just kind of did it to see what it felt like. And then I had I have a beard, so it's not very pleasant pulling it off. So, but I've had a number of patients really come back and say that mouth taping has significantly changed their lives, right? And they've don't use a CPAP machine and have really felt that mouth taping has significantly reduced their symptoms of sleep apnea. Yeah. I like KT tape, and then there's medical tape is a little bit sometimes not sticky enough, like the medical paper tape. So I usually say like you kind of need like a sports tape. Yeah, so like KT is a kinesio tape, basically. It's so that's kind of a stretchier, thicker tape. It is quite sticky though, so like I said, it did pull out some of my beard hairs. So yeah, so that's the deal with apnea and snoring and some of breathing considerations there. Okay.
There's a woman in Lincoln Park that passed away about a year ago, and they said the CPAP machine killed her. Have you ever heard that?
In what way? Do you know exactly like how?
I don't know in what way.
Okay.
It's got very sick and died. They said it was the CPAP machine.
So one thing that kind of comes to mind there is, was it cleaned, right? Did it accumulate a bunch of bacteria, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, what were you going to say, Bob?
Exactly that.
Okay, yeah,
Must clean the mask.
sure.
Well, maybe she didn't clean it.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either.
That would probably be the maybe most, I don't know that it's common, but I would say the most direct way that I could see a CPAP harming somebody. You know, but no, I mean, I don't know. I would need a lot more maybe details about that case to comment more.
One other thing as well, if the machine switches off,
Sure.
you go off mask.
Right, then it might be very suffocating. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, I wonder what kind of safeties are built into those for that reason. But no, yeah, and a lot of people for a variety of reasons really don't like CPAP machines, right? If you travel, you know, just having all the headgear on, it's some people feel very claustrophobic sometimes with this sort of stuff on, you know, and there are alternatives that I feel like just really don't get discussed much. And so again, just here, at least now you at least know a few tools and can share those with folks that might ask you about it too. So sleep medication supplements, just a kind of quick reminder, you know, the way I think about sort of substances, medication supplements, I really put everything into one category. Okay, I don't break things up into this is natural and this is pharmaceutical and this and that. I think a better way for me as a physician to think about things is we have a certain nature in biology. There are things that have been created by nature or modified by man that can manipulate certain aspects of our biology. And I don't get too much into, was it made by a plant fungus or modified in a lab or what, right? My kind of gauge for whether something is helpful is, does it treat the target of action, right? Is it helping you, right, with what the problem is? Number two, what is the safety of this, right? What are the other effects that this might have in your body, right? Those are probably the main two things I'm worried about when we're looking at a compound chemical, something of that nature. So anyway, I just like to kind of put that out there so everybody knows sort of where I'm at in thinking about these things. You know, sleep is very problematic as far as developing medicines, using supplements, other things like that really goes. And I've sort of alluded to this when we were talking about what is sleep, right? So how do we get a substance to mimic 4 different stages of brain activity, and then a sort of separate whole other entity of REM sleep, right, which is sort of a mysterious kind of thing in itself, right? You can just start to understand now why this is so hard to mimic with medicines, right? So there are some medicines that sort of put us into maybe this light sleep, but sort of destroy deep sleep and REM, right? There, you know, and that's actually what most medicines do, right? Is you might get sort of more light sleep, but a lot of medicines seem to really interfere with our brain transitioning into those specific waves of deep sleep, as well as sort of transitioning in and out of REM at appropriate times and for appropriate intervals. Of these medications, some of the worst ones are really meaning they have the most harm. To be clear, what I mean by that are going to be sort of your sedative hypnotic class. So your Ambien, Zolpidem, sort of your Z drugs, Lunesta, some of these other kind of powerful sleep aids, as well as sort of the benzodiazepine category of brand name drugs like Ativan, Xanax, some of those types. They end in PAM mostly, right? These drugs not only really destroy sleep architecture, they also increase your chance of death and increase your chance of cancer. And those are proportional to how many pills you take a year. Okay, so taking a benzodiazepine or an Ambien because you flew to Japan, totally fine, right? Taking an Ambien every single night to go to sleep, definitely significant increase in risk. Okay, so I am not saying that these medicines cannot be used for any reason, right? I think there are some very good reasons to temporarily have something like this on board. But I just really strongly would recommend against chronic use of these medications. Again, based on the science around these drugs, not because I have any reason to dislike them. And I kind of, again, I think what the best statement I could make about them is that, again, unconsciousness is not sleep, right? And what these drugs definitely seem to do is induce a state of unconsciousness, right? But they do not seem to really induce a state of appropriate sleep, right? And sleep is not just unconsciousness. Yes.
So where do gummies, THC?
I'm coming to that. Yep. So melatonin, let's just go down the list here. So melatonin does have some marginal evidence. You know, a lot of people, I think, maybe use very high doses that are really unnecessary. Even a 1 or 3 milligram melatonin is already several hundred times probably higher than the melatonin levels that we naturally create. Timing is very important, right? So as we learned in this talk, melatonin is a darkness hormone. So taking this about 30 minutes before your bedtime is really kind of the recommendation here. This can really be most effective when we're switching time zones, okay? So if you're traveling and switching time zones in a new kind of light, dark, time zone, then melatonin can really help to maybe transition you into that new time zone, right? So especially for travel, I'd say that's where melatonin seems to perform the best. I tend to avoid things like melatonin in children, just because children have chronically high melatonin. It's involved in actual puberty suppression. And I just feel that in children that maybe not messing with melatonin is probably a better idea. Okay. That being said, again, there is no official recommendation of that nature. So it is not necessarily, there's no big guideline saying you can't do this in children. That's just sort of my personal preference. Okay. But for adults, I do think it can be a safe intervention. I'd say the biggest thing I hear about it is that it didn't help. Okay. Magnesium, many different forms. L-threonate seems to be the one that crosses into the brain and causes the best sleep effects. But all forms of magnesium seem to perhaps help with sleep in some people. They can help with some mild muscle relaxation. So again, if you're having cramps or other aches and pains, magnesium can be kind of a double that helps you sleep, and also maybe gives you more comfort overnight from a muscular standpoint. So theanine, apigenin, these are both basically derived from teas, things like chamomile and other sleepy teas. Theanine is just an amino acid. Apigenin, I forget exactly what that is, but it's an extract I know from chamomile tea. And both of these compounds have some favorable data to help with transitioning into sleep, help with control of anxiety. And some people will report really vivid dreams or other things like that. Again, that may not necessarily be a bad thing. That might mean that you're sort of actually getting the REM that you need, especially if you've been deprived from REM. The brain has sort of a rebound phenomenon. When you haven't had appropriate REM sleep, it will selectively try to sort of make up that REM sleep when it's able to. And so that's what I think may explain some of this, is that if you've gotten chronically poor sleep and then we get you to get some higher quality sleep, you may selectively have a little bit more dreaming or lucid dreaming or vivid dreams. Sometimes it's just bothersome to people. They just wake up and they feel like, they're sort of consumed by their dreams. And that's a problem that sometimes, again, I think should just be discussed with your provider, right? And one of the things you can do about that is to start journaling, right? Your dreams and trying to make some sense of them. There's this concept of lucid dreaming where you can actually sort of be in a semi-sleep, semi-wake state and start to maybe even gain some control over your dreams. And that can be sometimes a tool to help people deal with sort of, let's say, vivid or unpleasant dreams or nightmares, something of that nature. Complex subject, again, something that we talk about more individually if that's the case. Trazodone is a prescription medicine, one of the few prescription medicines that doesn't seem to interfere as much with sleep signals or sleep architecture rather. So again, as far as prescription meds go, I would say personally, that's probably my first line choice for most people, something like Trazodone. Okay. CBD, THC, to address kind of the gummies and just this kind of class of medications altogether, cannabinoids. There's many more cannabinoids than just those two. And again, we're kind of in a renaissance of research around some of these cannabinoids and how to use them more appropriately. But THC and CBD both seem to have some data to really help you to transition into sleep, lowering sleep latency. THC specifically does have some data supporting that it can reduce time in REM sleep. Okay, so that's something to kind of consider. If you're not getting really restorative sleep on those gummies, then it might be that it's sort of blocking REM for you. Okay, and that either going to a lower dose or trying something else might be helpful there. Again, we don't have great long-term data on this. What does that look like after you've maybe taken gummies for 3 months consistently, 6 months consistently? The body is highly adaptive, and I would guess that there is an adaptation there that's made. I just, again, don't have that data available to sort of tell you guys what that might look like. And then CBD seems to maybe interfere with REM slightly less. Specific forms of CBD, again, may really help with anxiety overnight. Some of these may be involved in body temperature control. And so, again, I would say jury's still kind of out, but I would say as far as kind of the whole library of sleep aids, I would put these sort of on the lower risk side. Okay, so any other questions about that specifically?
THC, does the body temperature too?
I think so. I think it can. I may have to review that, but that's what I'm sort of remembering off the top of my head. But yeah, I'll try to verify that. Okay. And then kind of a newer class of drugs. I'd mentioned this hormone just briefly, kind of as the opposite hormone of melatonin called orexin. Okay, this is something that increases as we're transitioning into daytime and is thought of as sort of an alertness, awakeness kind of hormone of the brain. And so it has been developed as sort of a target of treatment, right? So these are meds like the brand names of Qvivic, Devigo, Balsamra, I think, are the three that are out on the market right now. They're a little bit on the expensive side if you don't have insurance. Sometimes they're hard to acquire these kind of medicines. However, I've had some good success with these medicines, especially in those people that have sort of tried the rest of this talk, maybe several other medications, right? And seems like in a lot of these folks that are sort of resistant, to not that they're resistant, meaning they're just not responding to the things we're trying. This seems to be a nice choice in some people. So that's kind of a newer class of drugs that I think a lot of people in the sleep world are excited about. Okay. Any other questions about just supplements, exogenous compounds of any kind?
Well, the magnesium, how much are you talking about?
So generally, I would say about 130 milligrams of elemental magnesium, which may mean that the dose on the bottle might be very much higher. So you'll have to kind of look, it'll have a total dose that will be like the total weight of all the magnesium salts. And then it will usually break it down and say there's this much actual magnesium contained within them. So magnesium, in order to be given, has to be sort of, it's a salt basically, so it has to be combined with a sort of negative, charged particle. And anyway, so that's why there's that difference there. But about 100 to 150 milligrams of elemental magnesium should start to have an effect.
And is that in a normal daily?
That would be, yeah, so that high a dose of magnesium generally is not going to be found in a multivitamin. That is generally going to need to be a magnesium specific supplement.
You take that at night?
You can definitely take this at night selectively, a couple hours, 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. Yes, yeah, yeah. So, any other questions about compounds?
Another question. Easier to take it every night.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Does work. Is there any long-term disadvantage to take?
Not that I'm aware of, right? In fact, there has been sort of a thought that perhaps in the modern diet, magnesium is slightly deficient in most of us. Okay, so as long as you have healthy functioning kidneys and you're not accumulating magnesium, let's say to high serum levels, right, there is no harm that I'm aware of long term. Okay, yeah, so definitely want to maybe check your kidney function at least once or twice a year, right? If you have any concerns there about kidney function. Everyone who's a part of this clinic I usually require you to get once yearly labs. So you'll at least get that looked at once by me if you're here. And then again, if you have specific issues that might hurt your kidneys or sort of have mild kidney impairment, we may want to check that more often. Okay. All right. Last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about sleep trackers and some technology that might be helpful in this arena. Okay, so there are several kind of little wearable devices out there that actually do a remarkable job of sort of telling you, how you're transitioning through phases of sleep, what your oxygen levels might be overnight, what your heart rate is doing overnight, all sorts of different things that these little devices can really tell you, right? So of those, I list a couple there: the Oura Ring, the Whoop, Apple Watch, Fitbit. There's several others out there, I'm sure, that I'm maybe even not aware of. But again, these can be very helpful for just gaining more knowledge, right? One of the ways that it detects the different phases of sleep, or stages of sleep rather, is, like I said, through that knowledge that during REM, we should be totally paralyzed, right? So one of the things it tracks is movement overnight. The other thing that a lot of these things can track, and some of these apps can do as well, is apnea tracking. And that might be through snoring. And sometimes, I forget if some of them have oxygen trackers or not, but I think those are being added to a lot of these devices. So that can kind of intuit, right? If your oxygen level is going down overnight, then I would say you really have to consider apnea. But again, just tracking even snoring time, right? They'll record your snoring. It will tell you how many decibels it is. It might give you information you don't want. And again, not just around sleep tracking, but also around maybe improving your sleep, right? So there's the VA has developed an evidence-based app called Insomnia Coach. There's this app called Reverie that's for self-hypnosis. There's at least 4 or 5 really quality meditation apps out there: Waking Up, Calm, Headspace, many others, 10% Happier, all sorts of things depending on what exactly it is that your goal is, whether it's relaxation or tracking or gaining insight or whatever, right? There's a lot of different things out there nowadays, and a lot of these resources are free. Okay, so some of them, of course, are paid for. Obviously, the devices have a cost there. Some of them even have subscription plans on top of that. But many of these apps especially are totally free, okay, or really affordable, let's say, if not completely free. The bed cooling devices, these do tend to have a pretty high cost sometimes, so that might be cost prohibitive for some of us. However, there are some of these, if heat is sort of a problem, if you're waking up sweaty, right, if we're always kind of hot overnight, or if maybe we have a bed partner that's sort of a different temperature than us, there are some of these devices that actually will split the bed, and you can make one side warmer and cooler, right? So lots of things there that are coming up in sort of the bed and bed devices as far as those go. For snoring or apnea, there are some beds that now will detect whether you're apneic or not and raise the head of the bed if you start holding your breath. So lots of cool kind of things coming out here to help us to really understand our sleep better, improve our sleep, and then to, kind of, again, specific things like cool during the night. Yep.
Are these devices standalone devices, or do they require Wi-Fi?
So a lot of these bed coolers are sort of, so the apps, obviously most of them you do need an internet connection because they're on a phone. The devices often require some internet connection, yes, just to upload data and things like that. But I think you can view all of your stuff whether you're connected to the internet or not. And then the bed devices, those are kind of across the board. A lot of these are like mattress toppers. Some sell like a whole bed. But a lot of them are really like a additional kind of device. They have like a little air, cooler kind of device that goes on the side, and then sort of a topper on your mattress, so you can kind of put them onto your pre-existing bed. As far as the bed devices go. Okay, does that answer your question? Okay.
I just don't have Wi-Fi, so I'm always locked out of a lot.
Fair enough. Gotcha. Yeah, so some of this stuff I would say, I don't know the answer to every single one, but I'm sure some of them require an internet connection, some of them don't. So
A lot of them also use Bluetooth, which still has association with Wi-Fi, but what's really cool about the devices is tracking and getting data constantly. So if you go, say you go camping for one night, then it can still be tracking, but you don't get to see
Download
that much quickly to get reconnected. So, and it's always having algorithms collecting data. So this one is like track.
yes. All right. Well, that was my last slide. A lot of my resources, hopefully you guys are aware of, these are free resources for everybody. I realize that some of them might be a little dense for the non-physician, non-scientist, kind of non-science trained individual. However, there are some really approachable things out there. As always, Dr. Peter Attia, who's one of my role models, really does have a lot of material around sleep, how to improve sleep. A lot of what I talked about today are some of his interviews with like sleep experts like Matt Walker. He's got a great book called Why We Sleep. Lots of new material coming out on this. People really prioritizing sleep. Huberman Labs, similar kind of story. Yeah, he's a non-physician scientist that teaches in a medical school at Stanford and has tons of material on sleep as well. Interviews some of the same people there as well. This is actually Matt Walker's kind of research website, Human Sleep Science. So there you can actually look at a lot of the data around sleep and kind of see new up and coming things there. And then we have the sleepfoundation.org, and that specifically is kind of linked to that article about the mouth and palate exercises. But Sleep Foundation has tons of good, recommendations and other kind of best practices listed there as well. Again, I think that the literature on this subject, the awareness, the tools are really, really growing. It's really becoming much more prominent that yes, sleep is a very important, essential part of our lives. There's not an option to really live our fullest with the lack of sleep. So I'm very happy to see that that's where the culture is sort of shifting. Okay. Yeah, so that's what I got for you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. So we got our next talk here scheduled for next month on the 8th. We like to do this 10 o'clock hour on Fridays just because, again, I have Fridays off, and I realize this is during business hours for some of my folks that are working on Fridays. I apologize, and that's why I put it on YouTube. And again, our YouTube channel there is just youtube.com/@DesertRiverMed, same as our website. That does live. We have a link directly from our website as well. I try to put up a bunch of information on my website that's helpful for the general public. So again, just all I can really do is make it available to you guys. Again, your responsibility is to take that torch and try to use some of these tools and figure out what works for you. Or if we change nothing, nothing changes. Something I say a lot, right? So try some stuff. Just shake it up, right? Try something different. Have some consistency. Try it for a week, right? Don't give up after a day. Another big message I don't know that I mentioned here, right? But, oh, I took magnesium one night. It didn't help. It's in the trash. Bad idea. Right? Try something consistently for a week or two. right, before you really decide. And that's where, again, data tracking can be really important. Consistency, right? So many little variables throughout our day. You don't want to make a decision based on one 24-hour period. All right. But yeah, try some stuff, try it for a while, ask for help. Okay. um,
Always said that if people would get an extra hour of sleep, as most people are deprived, extra hour of sleep would change the world. You know,
It
like there'd
may.
be less accidents, there'd be less, angry situations.